The men were nervous. They didn't like being out in the elements. This planet was one of the coldest that were eligible to terraform. It was called Cantris. The planet didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. The universe was full of millions of colonies that were more important than Cantris. However, this barren, icy rock was their home, and they were tired of being ruled by the Interplanetary Council. The invading tyrants were politicians that knew nothing of the problems of the smaller planets. So, the Cantrans rebelled against the Interplanetary Council forces, also called the ICF. They had been fighting against the military for 8 months now. They were winning, too. The rebel forces could not fly anything for the first few months, but on the ground, they won every single battle. Over time, they took out most of the military there, and now they had control over the majority of territories. The planetary defense guns were in their control now, too. Immense laser cannons that stood over 60 feet tall and that were capable of destroying ships in orbit. These guns could destroy aircraft, dropcraft, and anything else that got within its incredible range, which meant almost nothing got down to the planet without destroying the defense guns first. Almost nothing. A rain of space-to-surface missiles had come down that morning in a rural area, far from most of the rebels' forces. These missiles were usually loaded with explosives, but they could also be loaded with troops to deploy from space to ground. The one massive defense gun in range could destroy so many. One of the rebel leaders, Lieutenant Salno, took a force of over 100 men to secure the area. Lieutenant Salno had spread his men out around the rim of the valley where the drop missiles had landed. He was tall, wore a brown coat, and you could see his black armor underneath his coat that was only half buttoned. His clothes were nice, with the rebel's symbol sewn into the right arm. He had an official look about him. His thick, black mustache and gray speckled short-cut hair gave him a menacing look. To many, he seemed to have a permanent scowl. There was some sparse tree cover and lots of scrub brushes that were mostly bare. The ground had a thin layer of snow, so most of the landscape was white. The men moved in and began to spread out immediately. The Cantran rebels had access to all manner of weapons: handguns, machine guns, laser guns, missile launchers, grenades, and even some tanks and weapon drones. There looked to be about 30 missile pods that dropped earlier that morning, but it appeared that only one had opened. The pods were black, mostly smooth, and over 10 feet long, only wide enough for one person to fit inside each. The black pods stood out boldly from the white snow, an ominous sign. Lieutenant Salno thought it was strange. Possibly the missiles were just a test of the defenses, and they were all empty. Or maybe the military had sent the barrage to get just a few scouts down to the surface in 3 or 4. After a few hours stationed around the missiles, Lieutenant Salno took 30 men in a truck down closer. He himself rode in a jeep with a mounted laser cannon turret. Most of the men had tattered clothing. Some had the rebel symbol on their right arms. Many were middle-aged and had obviously lived hard lives. The vehicle stopped about 100 feet away from the closest pods. They were beginning to lose the light, so they had their headlights on. The men spread out in a line, with the flashlight attachments on their weapons lighting up in every direction. Most had standard rifles, but some had laser weapons. Lieutenant Salno stepped out of his vehicle and walked up to his men.
"Spread out further, you idiots! We don't want anyone flanking us!"
Lieutenant Salno spat menacingly. He was known to be curt with his men, but his ferocity on the field made up for it to many. "Contact, sir," said the man closest to Lieutenant Salno. 20 flashlights trained on the same target. A single man walked toward them from the pods. He was wrapped in a dark robe that flowed down past his knees. Barely visible beneath it, his clothes were magnificent, made from some of the finest materials known to man. His dark blue, loose-fitting pants led down to his fine black boots. His long-sleeved shirt was a lighter blue and also loose-fitting. His hood was up, and his head was bent low. You could not see his face or his right arm. His cloak almost seemed to absorb the light from the flashlights, and it looked as though no light shone upon it.
You must be here as a diplomat, coming alone, and unarmed. What are you, insane?
Lieutenant Salno yelled. The man continued to walk slowly forward, undisturbed. He either did not hear or did not care. He was within 150 feet now.
Hey, stop! I'm warning you, stop now or else. I don't know what game you're playing, but you're gonna get yourself killed.
Lieutenant Salno continued, a bit flustered now. His men readied to fire, all prepared to kill the man at a word. The black-robed man continued forward and raised his head. His dark eyes were narrowed to show a killing intent. His robe shifted, and he raised his right arm, revealing a device strapped to his right wrist. The base was a white metal gauntlet, with one large piece covering his arm from hand to elbow. A large blue disc was attached to it, and a blue dome light shimmered, dancing over its surface. Blue, wavy light emanated from it, and white sparkles danced throughout its light. It can't be. Not a Magi. I thought they were a myth, Lieutenant Salno whispered. He referred to a well-known rumor in which many say the ICF had a group of elite soldiers called magicians, commonly known as Magi. These individuals supposedly wielded a blue disc that was literally capable of altering reality around them. They set entire fields ablaze, hurled giant boulders large enough to destroy buildings, opened metal walls like it was a sliding door, and much more. These magicians had been seen by ICF soldiers on the battlefield, but were always told it was simply new types of weapons being tested. However, the stories always had a black-robed figure with a blue glowing disc on their arm. It was basically magic, as far as many were concerned, and so they were named magicians. It was said they could destroy entire armies by themselves. Lieutenant Salno noticed that all snow behind the man was gone. It was just brown dirt now. Then he saw the ground looked like it was shimmering behind the black-robed man. It looked like moving water.
Fire! Fire now! Kill him!
Lieutenant Salno began shouting after a second of horror at realizing his situation. But alas, it was a second too long. Just as his men were going to fire, a wall of water shot up in front of the man. The Cantron weapons opened fire, but they all hit the water wall instead of the Magi. Bullets penetrated the wall, but it was already over 15 feet thick and growing quickly. The lasers did not fare as well as the bullets. They only went a foot into the water. The laser cannon on the Jeep began to open fire as the wall rose to 20 feet high and 100 feet across. The laser cannon explosions forced huge gaps into the wall, but to no effect. All the men on the valley rim opened fire as the water wall began to rise to 30 feet and completely covered a few hundred square feet. None of them realized how futile it was to shoot a giant wall made of water and began to surge forward. The closest men were swept up before they could run 2 steps. The others almost got to the truck when they were engulfed. The wall was over 50 feet tall now. Lieutenant Salno was the only one spared drowning. The water seemed to simply flow around him until he was enclosed in a small air pocket in the middle of this tsunami. Some of the men at the valley top tried using the drones to fly over the tsunami in hopes of killing the Magi. As they got close, however, a cycling wind blasted them out of the sky, shattering them to pieces. The tsunami grew to over 100 feet tall as it closed on the men at the rim of the valley. None of the troops or vehicles escaped. A wall of water swallowed them all completely. It was a brutal way to die, and many who realized their mistake before the end wished they had never challenged the Magi. Drowning slowly, their lives flashed before their eyes, some never really knowing what had happened. They had learned too late the true power of the council. Over 100 men killed in minutes. all but one. Lieutenant Salno cowered in a ball 15 feet in front of the Magi, who continued to walk toward him in the same slow, purposeful manner he had before. His disk still glowed faintly, but it seemed dormant now. When he was within 5 feet, he stopped. Just then, another one of the black missile pods popped open.
Magician Cal! Wait for me!
Squeaked a voice. A small girl no older than 18 ran up. She also wore blue, an official-looking aqua-colored dress with white trim. Her legs were covered in darker blue leggings under her dress, ending in long white boots. She wore a thick white coat over everything, with symbols denoting her as a member of the ICF, with her rank of apprentice on each sleeve. Her straight white hair went down past her shoulders, and her brown eyes seemed black in the darkness.
Apprentice Tabitha, stand back. I'm not done yet.
Scolded Magician Call, his black robes flowing gently in the wind.
I can help, though!
Said Tabitha. Her high-pitched voice would not be so bad if she did not seem to constantly yell. He shot her a dangerous look, and she grew quiet. Call then turned back to Lieutenant Salno. As Tabitha realized her mistake, a pouty look spread across her face that could melt the heart of someone less callous. Call, however, barely noticed as he continued his pursuit of this walking dead man.
Daniel Salno, you have been found guilty of crimes against the Interplanetary Council, including destruction of federal property, disregarding federal regulations, assault, murder, and treason. The penalty for this is death. Do you have any last words?
Call said in a monotone voice, reading off a tablet he held in his left hand.
Please, don't.
Was all Lieutenant Salno could sputter, still in a state from his experience.
Tabitha write, please don't, in the log, as Lieutenant Salno's last words.
As he instructed her, she produced her own tablet and began to type. This was obviously the most tedious thing in the world to both of them, as though executing this man was as monotonous as the logs they entered into their tablets.
Just a moment. I can never get this thing to work fluidly. I'm so sorry, Master!
Tabitha almost yelled as she hurriedly worked to enter the data correctly.
How can someone with such obvious talent as a Magi be so bungling? Honestly, Apprentice, if not for your battle capabilities, neither I nor the Academy would put up with it. As is, you still show the most promise in battle, but try my patience again and you'll find it is run out.
Call reprimanded, his calm face finally slipping into obvious irritation.
Let's finish this.
As Salno realized he was done for, his eyes grew wide. He barely saw the stone blade that formed in a second and beheaded him. It hung in the air a moment after slicing off Salno's head. A brown stone about 3 feet across and almost paper thin. Then it disintegrated and fell back to the earth.
Ew!
Tabitha let out as blood erupted from the man's neck.
Ew. Really? You've killed dozens of men in your training, still this is your reaction. What am I going to do with you, Apprentice?
Cal managed to say, palming his face with both hands.
What now, boss?
Tabitha squeaked after a short, awkward silence as she walked up beside Call. Call turned to her and simply said,
Now we take back the rest of this world.